It was late in the evening, and the highway stretched endlessly into the distance under dim, flickering streetlights. Traffic was light, almost non-existent, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel louder than it should be. Tires humming against the asphalt, wind brushing past moving vehicles, the occasional distant engine fading into the night. Inside a black SUV, a man drove alone. No music, no conversation, just silence. His posture was relaxed, his hands steady on the wheel, eyes focused ahead. To anyone passing by, he looked like an ordinary driver returning home after a long day. Nothing unusual, nothing that would draw attention. But moments like these often carry the most unpredictability. As the SUV continued forward, the road remained empty, until suddenly, faint red and blue lights began to appear in the rearview mirror. At first, they seemed distant, almost easy to ignore, but within seconds they grew brighter, closer, more persistent. The driver glanced up, noticing the lights reflecting off the glass, a subtle shift in his expression. He didn't panic, he didn't react aggressively. Instead, he signaled calmly and began to slow down, guiding the vehicle toward the side of the road. The SUV came to a smooth stop on the shoulder. Engine off, lights dimmed. Silence returned, heavier this time. The man placed both hands clearly on the steering wheel, following standard procedure. Still, visible, cooperative. Outside, the night remained quiet, but something had changed in the atmosphere. A patrol car pulled in behind him, its lights casting alternating red and blue reflections across the road and the back of the SUV. Doors opened, footsteps approached, slow, measured, intentional. The driver remained motionless, waiting. He had seen stops like this before. He knew how they were supposed to go, but something about the pacing, the hesitation in the air felt different this time. Not routine, not relaxed. And as the officers moved closer, their presence became more defined, more imposing. What began as a simple stop on a quiet highway was no longer just a routine encounter. It was the beginning of something that neither side had fully anticipated. And whatever was about to happen next would unfold in ways no one standing there could yet predict. The patrol car came to a complete stop behind the black SUV, its headlights cutting sharply across the rear bumper. The rhythmic flash of red and blue lights painted the empty highway in alternating colors, creating an atmosphere that felt less like a roadside stop and more like a staged moment under surveillance. Two officers stepped out of the vehicle. Their movements were coordinated, but not casual. Each step felt deliberate, as if they were already assessing the situation before even approaching the driver. One officer moved toward the driver's side. The other hung back slightly, scanning the surroundings, his flashlight briefly sweeping across the roadside, the vehicle, and the dark stretch of highway beyond. The beam then landed on the SUV's windows, reflecting back in a brief glare. Inside, the driver remained still, hands visible, posture unchanged. The officer on the driver's side approached the window and paused just outside the doorframe. For a moment, there was silence, just the sound of passing wind and the faint hum of distant traffic far behind them. Then came the knock, a firm tap on the glass. The driver lowered the window. "Good evening," the officer said, though his tone carried little warmth. "Step out of the vehicle." The instruction was direct, no explanation, no greeting beyond the surface level. The driver looked up calmly. "May I ask the reason for the stop?" he replied. That single question introduced a subtle shift. The officer's posture tightened slightly. The second officer, still circling the vehicle, angled his flashlight directly into the cabin, scanning the interior with slow, methodical movements. "Step out of the vehicle," the first officer repeated, his voice firmer this time. "Don't make this difficult." The driver paused briefly. He didn't argue, he didn't raise his voice. Instead, he exhaled quietly and reached for the door handle. Outside, the second officer completed his circle around the SUV and returned toward the front, exchanging a brief glance with his partner. The atmosphere between the two officers suggested something unspoken, an assumption forming, a judgment already taking shape. As the door opened, the driver stepped out slowly, keeping his movements controlled and visible. No sudden motions, no resistance, just compliance. But despite his cooperation, the tone of the encounter had already begun to shift. What started as a routine stop was no longer feeling routine at all. The night air felt cooler outside the vehicle. As the driver stepped fully onto the roadside, the contrast between the quiet highway and the flashing patrol lights became more intense. Red and blue reflections pulsed across the asphalt, the SUV, and the faces of the officers standing nearby. The first officer closed the distance slightly, positioning himself near the driver's side door. His stance was firm, shoulders squared, eyes fixed. The second officer continued to move around the vehicle, his flashlight sweeping in slow arcs across the windows, dashboard, and rear seats, as if searching for something beyond the obvious. "License and registration," the first officer said. The request was standard, but the tone carried an edge that suggested this was more than a formality. Without hesitation, the driver reached into his pocket and handed over the documents. No resistance, no delay, no visible sign of tension, just cooperation. The officer took the documents, glanced at them briefly, then looked back at the driver. His expression changed slightly, not overt, but noticeable enough to suggest suspicion rather than neutrality. "You're pretty calm," the officer remarked. The comment lingered in the air. The driver met his gaze. "I'm just following instructions," he replied evenly. A pause, not long, but enough to create a subtle shift in the interaction. The second officer returned from circling the vehicle and stepped closer, now joining the conversation. He glanced at the driver, then at the documents in his partner's hand. "Turn around," the first officer suddenly ordered. "Hands behind your back." The instruction came without context. The driver blinked slightly. "For what reason?" he asked calmly. The officer's tone hardened. "Don't question me, just comply." At that moment, the dynamic of the stop began to change more noticeably. It was no longer just procedural. It was becoming confrontational. The driver didn't move immediately. He stood still for a brief moment, processing the instruction, maintaining composure. Meanwhile, the second officer shifted his weight, stepping slightly closer, creating a sense of pressure from both sides. The flashing lights continued to rotate, casting moving shadows across their bodies, the road, and the surrounding darkness. In the distance, a few vehicles approached, their headlights growing brighter as they neared the scene. As they passed, some drivers slowed down, noticing the unusual tension on the shoulder. Inside one passing car, a passenger leaned forward slightly, looking out the window. Another driver subtly adjusted speed, glancing over more than once. The scene was no longer isolated. It was beginning to attract attention. Back on the shoulder, the first officer remained focused on the driver, waiting for compliance that had not yet fully come. The second officer circled slightly again, his flashlight now held lower, no longer just scanning the vehicle, but occasionally glancing at the driver himself. Their body language suggested a growing expectation, one that was not being met with resistance, but also not with immediate submission. The silence between instructions and action began to stretch, and in that silence, tension built, not from words spoken loudly, but from what was not being said at all. What should have remained a straightforward stop was now entering a space where perception, authority, and reaction were beginning to intersect. And once that balance started to shift, it would not easily return. The pause didn't last long. The first officer exhaled sharply and took a half step closer,
his tone sharpening as he looked between the driver and the documents in his hand. "We're going to search the vehicle," he said. It wasn't phrased as a request, it was stated as a decision. The driver looked at him, steady and composed. "For what reason?" he asked. The question was calm, but direct. The officer didn't hesitate. "Suspicion, that's all you need to know." There was no elaboration, no clear explanation, just authority asserted without detail. The second officer moved toward the SUV immediately, opening the rear door without waiting for further discussion. The interior light flicked on, briefly illuminating the inside of the vehicle before being swallowed again by the darkness outside. The trunk followed. The latch popped open, and the rear compartment was lifted. Inside, the officers began to look through items, moving objects aside, shifting bags, checking compartments. Their movements were not careful or methodical in a respectful sense. They were quick, firm, and at times careless. The driver remained where he stood, still, watching, not reacting. Cars continued to pass in the distance, but now more of them slowed. Some drivers glanced over casually at first, then lingered longer as they realized something unusual was happening. A few vehicles reduced speed enough that passengers could clearly see the scene. Inside one car, a person leaned toward the window, phone already raised slightly. The presence of witnesses was no longer incidental, it was growing. Back at the SUV, the second officer leaned deeper into the interior, scanning the seats and dashboard area with his flashlight. The beam moved deliberately, pausing on certain points as if expecting something to appear. The first officer returned his attention to the driver. "You understand why we're doing this, right?" he asked. The question carried a tone that suggested an assumption rather than an explanation. The driver responded evenly. "I understand you're searching the vehicle." A brief silence followed, not hostile, but not cooperative in the way the officers seemed to expect. The second officer stepped back from the SUV and closed the door slightly, then looked toward his partner. A quick exchange of glances passed between them, subtle but telling. Their posture shifted, not relaxed, not satisfied, more like they were still searching for something that hadn't presented itself yet. "You know," the second officer said, stepping closer to the driver, "people who have nothing to hide usually don't act like this." The statement hung in the air. The driver turned his head slightly toward him. "I'm acting exactly as instructed." That response didn't escalate the situation outwardly, but internally it seemed to frustrate the officers, because despite their efforts, despite the search, the pressure, the positioning, they had not elicited the reaction they expected. No fear, no anger, no visible nervousness, just calm. And that calm in this environment was beginning to feel less like compliance and more like resistance in a different form. The search continued, but now the tone of the stop had shifted again, from procedural to probing, and from probing, counting towards something more unpredictable.
The search was still ongoing, but the energy around the scene had clearly changed. It wasn't just about checking a vehicle anymore. It was about control. The officers moved with increased intensity, as if expecting something to break the pattern of calm they had been facing since the beginning. The second officer stepped away from the SUV and returned to the driver's side, positioning himself slightly behind and to the side of the driver. His presence now felt more invasive, closer, tighter, more deliberate. The first officer closed the distance as well. Now, the driver was effectively surrounded within a small radius of space between the vehicle and the two officers. "Keep your hands visible," the first officer instructed. The driver complied immediately, raising his hands slightly in a visible, non-threatening position. Around them, the environment had changed too. Passing vehicles were slowing more noticeably now. A few had pulled over completely on the opposite side of the highway. People inside those cars were watching. Some had already begun recording, small screens glowing faintly in the dark. Inside one vehicle, a passenger leaned forward, zooming in with their phone camera. The scene was no longer private. It was being documented. Back on the shoulder, the officers continued to interact with the driver, but their tone carried a growing impatience. "You've been unusually calm since the beginning. Why is that?" The driver looked at him. "I'm following instructions," he replied again. The answer remained consistent, but the officers didn't seem satisfied. Instead, the first officer stepped closer and reached out, taking hold of the driver's arm. The grip was firm, not rough enough to escalate immediately, but strong enough to assert control. He adjusted the driver's arm slightly, as if checking positioning. "Stand still," he said. The driver winced faintly, not dramatically, but enough to indicate discomfort. He didn't pull away, he didn't resist, but the interaction had crossed into physical contact that went beyond simple instruction. A few bystanders in nearby cars reacted. One person lowered their window slightly. Another shifted in their seat, watching more intently. A phone camera stabilized, zooming in, recording. "Stop moving," the officer said again, though the driver had not made an aggressive movement. "I'm not moving," the driver responded calmly. The second officer let out a quiet laugh under his breath. "It feels like you're making this harder than it needs to be," he muttered. The tension between words and actions was becoming more noticeable now. The officers were no longer just observing, they were reacting, testing, pressuring, looking for a shift in behavior that would justify their growing suspicion. Then, without a clear verbal escalation, the first officer tightened his hold slightly while repositioning himself in front of the driver. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic movement, but it was enough to change proximity, enough to feel intrusive. The driver adjusted his stance subtly to maintain balance. Still controlled, still composed, but now more alert. The second officer stepped in closer at the same time, reducing the space further. The distance that once separated authority and subject had now nearly disappeared. The atmosphere became heavier, not because of loud voices, but because of closeness, presence, pressure. At this point, the situation had moved beyond standard procedure. It was no longer just about a document check or a vehicle search. It had become a physical interaction where control, perception, and reaction were all colliding in real time. And with witnesses watching from multiple angles and cameras recording every second, the next moment would determine whether the situation de-escalated or crossed a line that could not easily be walked back. The tension had reached a point where every small movement felt amplified. The officers were now positioned close enough that their presence alone created pressure, not through words, but through proximity and posture. The first officer maintained his hold, while the second officer hovered nearby, watching both the driver and his partner's actions closely. The driver, however, remained composed, his breathing steady, his posture upright, eyes focused, not aggressive, but no longer passive either. There was a noticeable shift in his awareness. "Relax," the first officer said, though his grip did not loosen. The words sounded less like reassurance and more like a command meant to maintain dominance in the interaction. The driver looked directly at him. "I am relaxed," he replied. A brief silence followed. The surrounding environment seemed to quiet down in contrast to the intensity of the moment. Even the passing vehicles appeared less frequent now. Those who remained nearby continued observing, some filming steadily, others watching without moving. Inside one car, a passenger whispered something to the driver, who nodded slightly while keeping his eyes on the scene. Back on the shoulder, the second officer adjusted his stance again, now slightly forward as if preparing to intervene if needed. His eyes moved between the driver's hands and his partner's grip. There was a subtle uncertainty in the coordination between the two officers, not disagreement, but a lack of clear synchronization in how far the situation should go. The first officer tightened his grip slightly again. "Turn a bit," he instructed. The driver complied with a small adjustment of his shoulders, maintaining balance while following the direction. At that moment, something changed. Not visibly dramatic, but perceptible. The driver's stance shifted from purely compliant to controlled responsiveness. He was still following instructions, but now with a level of precision and awareness that suggested he was fully engaged in the situation.
The second officer noticed this change. His expression tightened slightly. "You see that?" he said quietly to his partner. "He's not reacting like most people would." The first officer didn't respond immediately. His focus remained on the driver. The grip on the arm remained firm. The space between them felt compressed. Then came a moment where the first officer attempted to reposition the driver again, applying a slight guiding force. But this time, the movement met a subtle resistance, not forceful, not aggressive, but enough to signal awareness and control. The driver adjusted his footing to maintain stability rather than being moved passively. The interaction paused for a fraction of a second, a silent exchange of control dynamics, not spoken, but understood. The officers sensed it. This was no longer a one-sided interaction. The driver wasn't escalating verbally, he wasn't resisting openly, but he was no longer simply yielding either. That balance shifted the tone significantly. The second officer stepped closer again, now more alert, his attention sharpened. Meanwhile, the first officer slightly altered his grip, not releasing, but adjusting as if reassessing the situation in real time. Around them, the witnesses remained engaged, phones still recording, eyes fixed, no one speaking loudly, but everyone aware that something in the interaction had changed. The calm, controlled compliance that defined the earlier moments had evolved into something more complex, a silent recalibration of roles. Authority was still present, but it was being tested, not through confrontation, but through composure. And in that moment, both sides seemed to recognize the same unspoken reality. The outcome of this stop would depend not on who raised their voice, but on who maintained control when pressure was at its highest.
The tension that had built throughout the stop began to settle, not because the situation had escalated further, but because it had reached a natural breaking point where decisions had to be made. The first officer slowly loosened his grip on the driver's arm, not abruptly, not in a way that suggested defeat or victory, but gradually, as if reassessing the necessity of continued physical control. The second officer took a half step back, creating a bit more space between everyone involved. The shift in distance alone changed the atmosphere. It felt less compressed, less confrontational, more observational again. "All right," the first officer said after a brief pause, his tone noticeably calmer than before. "We're going to finish checking the vehicle." He turned slightly toward the SUV, signaling that the interaction was moving back toward procedure rather than confrontation. The driver remained in place for a moment, then lowered his hands slowly to a neutral position, keeping them visible and relaxed at his sides. No sudden movements, no verbal pushback, just steady compliance. The second officer returned to the vehicle and resumed the search, but this time his movements appeared more methodical and less hurried. The earlier intensity had been replaced with a more routine approach. Inside the SUV, compartments were checked again, seats adjusted, the trunk reopened briefly for a final look. Nothing appeared to stand out, nothing that justified escalation beyond what had already occurred. Meanwhile, the first officer stepped slightly aside, speaking quietly into his radio. His words were not audible to those nearby, but the action itself suggested communication with dispatch or coordination with additional units. The driver remained in place by the roadside, no longer at the center of direct attention, but still within the perimeter of the scene. Around them, the presence of bystanders remained. Some vehicles that had slowed earlier began to move again. Others lingered just a bit longer before eventually continuing on. Phones that had been recording gradually lowered, though a few remained pointed in the direction of the stop, capturing the final moments. After a few minutes, the second officer closed the SUV doors completely. He walked back toward his partner and gave a small nod, a silent signal. The search appeared to be complete. The first officer returned his attention to the driver. "Your documents are fine," he said, handing them back. His tone was now neutral, professional, detached from the earlier intensity. "You're free to go," he added. The words carried a clear conclusion. The interaction, which had begun as a routine traffic stop, had moved through multiple phases: observation, suspicion, search, physical proximity, and tension, before arriving at resolution. The driver accepted his documents without hesitation. "Thank you," he replied, simply. No additional words, no visible emotion beyond calm acknowledgement. He turned toward his vehicle, opened the door, and settled back into the driver's seat. The interior light flicked on briefly, illuminating the dashboard before fading again as the door closed. Outside, the officers returned to their positions. The first officer stepped back toward the patrol car. The second officer followed, giving one last glance at the SUV before turning away. The flashing lights remained on for a short while longer, then began to dim as the situation fully concluded. The highway returned to its usual rhythm. Cars passed without slowing. The witnesses who had remained nearby began to leave one by one. The scene that had drawn attention moments earlier was now dissolving back into the flow of everyday traffic. But for those who had seen it or recorded it, the memory of the interaction would linger. Not because of a dramatic confrontation, but because of how controlled, tense, and measured it had been from start to finish. A reminder that in situations where authority, perception, and composure intersect, the outcome is often determined not by volume or force, but by patience, restraint, and the ability to maintain control when pressure builds silently over time.